Welcome to Liquid Assets. I'm your host, Ravi Karani. Liquid Assets is a podcast where we talk about the intersection of business, policy, and technology, all as it looks at water. Today, I'm flipping the script and sharing my interview with the Clean Techies podcast with me on the other end of the mic. In this episode, we explore my journey from growing up as a pool boy in Southern California to founding Sutro, and my drive behind hosting the Liquid Assets podcast. I discuss how my background in engineering and impact investing in India shaped my passion for water technology and policy. We also tackle the big issues in water tech, from industry challenges and innovations to the energy-water nexus and outdated laws. This episode is packed with sharp insights and real talk about the future of water. Whether you're in the industry or just curious, there's something here for you. So grab a cup and enjoy this special edition of the Liquid Assets podcast, featuring my interview on the Clean Techies podcast. Let's hop in.
Welcome to the show, Ravi. How you doing?
I am doing good, guys. How are you guys doing?
Super well, honestly, man. Super excited to do this. It's not super often that we've got the chance to, or at least I've had the chance to meet you in person. So this doesn't happen with all our guests. So really excited for this one. I guess, let's just do a quick intro before we get into it too much. Like, tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're doing today.
Yeah, for sure. So my name is Ravi. I'm the founder and president of a water diagnostics company called Sutro. We basically make a colorimetric sensor that floats in swimming pools today and tells you exactly what chemistry is of your water and what to do. My kind of nights and weekends job, I guess, if you can call it, is also a podcast host, which this will also be posted on, called Liquid Assets. And Liquid Assets is a podcast that looks at the world of water through the lens of technology, business, and policy. And so if people are interested in that, you guys can also check out Liquid Assets.
Yeah, definitely check it out. You've had some pretty interesting guests on recently. I've been keeping up with most of them. I really like it. I guess, to give people maybe slightly more background on this, what we're doing is interviewing Ravi on all the different things he's learned through the podcast and maybe a couple other topics that we'll get into. But we actually originally kind of got in touch through LinkedIn because of our episode with Tom Ferguson, which I think we'll talk about. That's a really well-received episode. So I guess, maybe, where can we start? I'd say perhaps, why don't you give us some of the kind of key learnings that you've come across through doing the podcast? Like, what are the core things that you did not expect, but you've learned over the course of interviewing people now?
Yeah, I think it's actually interesting because I should probably go back to why I started the podcast. And as I said earlier, right, I'm the founder of a water company, and water is such a diverse industry that it's kind of funny that it actually gets lumped into this thing called water. And so as we were kind of exploring these other industrial markets, right, as I said, we were in swimming pools, so we're very much consumer focused. The industrial side, I was like, even walking down the streets of New York, talking to my wife, even introspectively looking into like the knowledge that I had. And I'm like, I don't know that much. And I'm like literally a water CEO. And so that's kind of why I started Liquid Assets, of like, how do I build a platform and a microphone such that I can learn more about this industry, but at the same kind of time that I'm doing that, also educate the other people around the world around what's actually happening in water. And so to kind of your point, some of the like really interesting things that I have learned in interviewing some of like the experts in water is, one, it's an extremely slow moving industry. Water is extremely pivotal to everything, right? We use it in a lot of our applications. It's obviously very important for drinking water, for agriculture. And because of that kind of high liability, it generally lends itself to having slower sales cycles because people don't want to actually change things that quickly. The second thing is actually a very overlooked industry on top of that. And so even though it is so important, people really don't kind of look at it as deeply as they should, right? We get so much investment in the next SaaS platform or, the next AI technology to help me read my emails better. But like, maybe we should figure out how I can get, cleaner water in my tap. And the third thing is there's a lot of innovation going on. I just think it hasn't really been spotlighted, for the first two reasons, right? The fact that it does have slow sales cycles and it isn't really as aggregated as it should be. And so that's kind of the three things that I've found in hosting Liquid Assets.
You've really learned a lot, not only as an operator, but somewhat of a community builder podcast host. But I feel like we jumped ahead a little bit. I want to hear from you. Water is a very unknown space, especially if you think about climate tech. Some people don't even consider water a viable investment because it doesn't decarbonize, right? And that's, you can decide where you fall on that. But you found water, right? In a couple different ways. So I'd love to hear that. How did you first come across this industry?
Yeah. Funnily enough, my dad used to own a chain of pool and spa supply stores. And so I was literally a pool boy. That's how I first came about, understanding about water and water chemistry. And growing up in sunny Southern California, right? There's pools everywhere. And back then, 30 years ago, I didn't think about water as an industry or VC or anything like that. I was just like, I got to test water chemistry because I need to understand the pH, chlorine, and alkalinity so I can make sure the water's safe for us to swim in. And through that experience, I ended up going into engineering, ended up getting an MBA, and worked actually at an impact investing fund in India. And that's really where I started to understand like the industry of water. Because in India, obviously, water is a very large problem. Water is the largest killer in the world, right? Through diarrhea and dysentery, the largest disease vectors are passed through water. And so I got to see a lot of interesting technologies even in India about 12 years ago. And kind of both of those experiences combined of being a pool boy and then running and being an associate at a VC fund in India, looking at a bunch of water deals really exposed me to the world of water, world of climate, world of kind of this impact investing world.
Yeah, so you're an insider in this world of pools. You are on the inside.
Yeah, entirely.
So for outsiders, as is, for most of our listeners on our platform, your listeners are probably a lot more experienced in the space. But as podcast hosts, we're not water experts. So generally speaking, how would you break down the water industry? What are the large categories?
Yeah, it's kind of funny. I think that goes back to my second point of it not really being entirely aggregated or kind of defined. But if I was to take a shot at it, there is consumer water and there's industrial water, right? I think, and I think I draw that distinction because I come at business from either a consumer or a B2B side, because I feel like sales cycles from a business standpoint really defines the industry and how you actually attack your customer. If you look at the consumer side, right, you really go back down to who uses water. What's your ideal demographic? How do you actually target those people? And so if you're thinking about consumer, right, obviously swimming pool is what I'm in. There's obviously drinking water, which is what many consumers use. And those are kind of like the two major points on how people use water outside of showering and using toilets or, washing machines or dishwashers. The other side of the spectrum is this industrials market. And the industrials market actually is where the bulk of the water is used. And also if people were to innovate, would be where you would actually get the biggest lift around actually solving things around efficiency, solving things around cleanliness, around safety. And that actually has a wide spectrum, right? So at the top of the list is actually agriculture. Agriculture uses the most amount of water to grow the food that we eat and also clean up the lagoons. They call them lagoons from the cattle farms that we have, which is basically cattle poop in a big pool. And then outside of that is also production, right? So if you look at oil and gas, if you look at production of plastics, production of silicone wafers, all use water. And then the kind of third part inside of that industrials industry would be around the built environment. And so we have things like cooling water towers. We also have water usage, which kind of blends into this consumer side of things. And so that's kind of how water is segregated, given also what I've done with the interviews at Liquid Assets. That's kind of how it's split up.
Okay, so you're looking at it, just to make sure I understand properly. You're looking at it from the consumer side, things that we interact and touch, drinking water, accessible water, pools, right? Wherever you would define, day to day where we're interacting with water. The second is the industrial use case. And I feel like to me, that felt very similar to decarbonization, right? We focus on our personal carbon footprint, but the real step change in the whole problem is if industry decarbonizes, right? And I think it sounds like here it's the same, where the real problems of usage, contamination, all happen on the industrial side. And what I want to know is, you're through Liquid Assets seeing the industrial problem through your company, you're on more of the consumer side. So you're seeing both sides. From your perspective of where you sit, where is most of the innovation headed, right? You're giving us a good idea of the problems and some of the breakdown. Where are we seeing actual innovations taking place?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting you say that because somebody can go to like Burnt Island Ventures, like Tom Ferguson. I think you guys have had him on your guys' podcast portfolio, right? And if you were to just look at his portfolio and what he's investing in, there again is a wide spectrum, right? If you look at what Tom's investing in, there is a smart shower company, right, that helps hotels, motels, and other places that you stay at basically more efficiently manage their water use.
Is this Rainstick?
What's up?
Is this Rainstick by chance?
I think it's Rainstick.
Okay.
I don't know the name, but I think it is Rainstick. On the kind of other side of the spectrum, you have a lot of the industrial use cases around, gray water or black water remediation, right? We have, and to kind of define that, we have a lot of water that's wasted, and we use fresh water for flushing toilets and for, watering plants. How do we take the water that we're using coming out of the tap for our consumption, recycle it so we can use it for kind of second and third degree functions on watering plants or washing our dishes? That requires a whole system. And there's I think a gentleman by the name of Aaron Tartakovsky who's working on a product. I forget the name right now, but really cool kind of black and gray water recycling system. And then you have a lot of innovation, even from like drone-based systems that fly over agricultural crops that see if plants are actually thriving or need more nutrients. So you're not over fertilizing, you're not over watering. And so I think actually there is innovation happening in kind of all of these verticals. And by proxy, if you just kind of look at what Tom's investing in, you can actually see that in his investment thesis.
Yeah. I think there's so many quite interesting problems going on here that, a lot of people aren't necessarily aware of. It's something, like you said, that a lot of people kind of, it just goes by the wayside. But one thing I just want to understand, I believe I've learned this through your podcast actually, is that the core kind of principles of what we're trying to do when it comes to sustainability and water are just reducing water consumption broadly, but also there's a huge amount of energy consumption in moving water and kind of processing. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah, there's an episode I did with Sean Hyatt from USC, where he actually talks about the energy water nexus. And energy and water is so intimately connected with each other that, yeah, it definitely does cost a lot of energy to move water, but also water is used in a lot of energy systems entirely.
Yeah. And I guess what are I think you've had some policy people on and obviously innovators. So what are the low lift things that people can do to that really, really simple solutions to help reduce water and reduce the energy consumption involved?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one, right? Because I think, for example, California policy is, I think, still uses laws from like the old Spanish colonial world that used to live in California from like the 1850s or something, or 1820s. Everything around like water ownership and like, if you dig and you find water, then that water's yours. And, I'm obviously simplifying, but like there's definitely archaic laws on the books still. And especially with something like the Central Valley, when you kind of fast forward California being this large agricultural state and water laws that were, still followed from the 1820s, I think you just generally have a discrepancy and a disconnectedness, right, around kind of what people are using to actually use the water and what policies are following. There's all of this stuff around like riparian networks, right, where like rivers, especially in the East Coast. My latest episode, the first week of July, actually has a lot of policy talk on the difference between groundwater and actually river water rights. At the end of the day, it all comes down to people need to use water, organizations need to use water, and the policies that dictate how we actually can access that water are either antiquated, are, built in times where maybe there was industries or the world looked very different. And thirdly, I think industries have also changed, right? And our water use and our population use is also growing. So to kind of succinctly answer your question, policy in particular and how to change policy is kind of a bit of an interwoven net. And especially with like commerce and the way that it's tied so heavily to agriculture and our GDP, it becomes extremely complex. But I think the first thing the audience can do, and this has come out of the podcast, is like understand actually where your water is coming from and where it's going to. And sure, you can take a 5-minute less shower. Like I'm not saying people shouldn't do that, but we should also understand where the heavy hitters are, kind of like Somil said, is especially with like climate tech and water tech, like the industrials and solving the things on the industrial side is really where we're going to get our biggest lift.
Yeah, I mean, they're obviously consuming a lot, right? There's a lot of individuals and you compile them together and there's plenty of consumption, but on the industrial settings, there's certainly got to be, efficiencies to be had there.
I think a big difference is also the decision makers you need to make an impact, right? Like the issue with the tragedy of the commons is you have so many people, you all need them to buy in, right? In order for that change to happen versus if you're looking at the industrial use case, it's likely maybe like a board, a plant manager, right? Maybe you're reporting to a couple of superiors. That's like 10 people that need to make the decision.
Yeah.
So I think that's a part of it. I feel like one thing about each industry is that there are the quirks, right? Like I focus on the built environment. The quirks there are, lots of regulation policy. It's inherently potentially not a profitable industry, right? Silas, you focus a lot on chemicals. There's a lot of niches there. Within water, what would you say are the trends that you've noticed? Like, this is a common theme of water solutions. They have to do this. They have to maybe go to market this way. Are there any commonalities?
Yeah, I'm finding that focusing on distribution is actually the kind of Achilles heel here, right? I think there's a dime a dozen ideas. There's a lot of really smart PhDs working on amazing technology, but figuring out how you can get it into market with kind of the first point that I made when we first kicked this off of sales cycles are really long. Okay, well, let's get to the kind of root of why sales cycles are really long. And that's what you just said, Soumya, right? There's a lot of people to talk to. There's the board, there's a plant manager, there might be somebody, the farmer, there might be the government official, the state of California, the governor might need to sign something into law, right? There's a lot of like parts and pieces that go around with water. And so I would say distribution. If like a company can figure out how to get into as many hands as possible, which is very similar to like a B2C problem of how do you get this in as many hands as possible, you're going to have success in actually getting your product out there.
So who are you trying to get into?
Yeah, I think that depends on the industry, right? So like because it is so fragmented, like let's double click into agriculture, for example. Selling to a farmer is very different if you have a large farmer that's subsidized in the Midwest compared to like a small farmer that does leafy greens in California. Margins are different, right? Corn is much cheaper. Soy is much cheaper. It's probably used as feed for cattle versus leafy greens from Taylor Farms is much more expensive. It has a higher margin, but they have smaller crop sizes, right? So also within agriculture itself, like there's obviously a diversification of who you're selling to from a demographic base. But let's just say you're focusing on California. Let's just say you're focusing on SGMA that just came out, which is a Surface Groundwater Management Act, which basically talks about how much groundwater you can actually have, as well as some nudge to kind of around runoff, right? Because a lot of this nitrification issue happens with green lakes. Let's just assume we have a product like Sutro, right? We want to measure and manage water chemistry. We want to figure out exactly how farmers can better manage their nutrients so they're having less runoff. They're putting the right amount of fertilizer in to the plants, so they're eating that up as they should. And secondly, they're going to use less water because we can optimize their crops given the seed life cycle. Who do I need to sell to? Right. First of all, there's obviously like the farmer. There's a great margin increase here that we can have. He or she needs to obviously manage the Groundwater Management Act that now the state of California has mandated that they follow. And they probably still need to sell into grocery stores, right? They still have their entire supply chain of how do I get this into a Vons, a Safeway, a Whole Foods? Like they're still trying to run their business, right? And so with this multifaceted approach, assuming that I can get in the market, I can go directly to Taylor Farms. Or maybe what I do is I pair with their fertilizer company, right? Maybe I work with somebody through a pilot to say, hey, look, we can actually upload your fertilizers into our app or into our web system. And we're going to better basically draw this box around how we can manage fertilizers because your fertilizers will get sold more efficiently, right? That's a distribution advantage versus me using a quote unquote B2C model going straight to the farmer. Is my margin as a company higher if I can go to every single farmer? Obviously. Will I probably die on the vine trying? Maybe. If I was in farming, maybe I knew everybody and I can call them up and I know that, right? That's my distribution advantage. And so I think I would kind of liken it that way, given this one really microscopic example.
Right. I'm wondering if, and part of like where I'm trying to get with this question is trying to understand, who holds the power in sort of the water dynamic. If you think about energy, right? You have energy selling into the grid managed by utilities and energy being given out, oftentimes managed by utilities, and startups are trying to make that more efficient, trying to make the home interaction between the grid and the utility more efficient. So utility is in the center and they take forever to buy new technology. And so a huge problem you cannot get away from is that long sales cycle. And long sales cycles, Silas, you talked about this came up. I wonder, is there sort of a middleman in water that sees a lot of the innovation and touches it and controls it? Or is it, maybe to your point, is it very varied and decentralized and you can't really make a general statement?
That is the problem with water. It is decentralized. And I wish there was like a middleman that we could go to, like a water utility, right? As a proxy to what you just said on the energy side. Unfortunately, it's like not so, right? Because energy primarily needs the grid to move from point A to point B. Water through the water cycle can come from anywhere, right? It can come from rain, it can come from fresh water, it can come from groundwater. And though there are regulations, though there is a water utility, and the water utility obviously supplies a lot of the water, the way that it's used is actually very different across the board. And unlike energy, where it's actually a raw input, which water, somebody can argue, is, it ends up getting used and then dispersed on the other end, where it can actually negatively affect the water source. Whereas energy that's used, there's kind of no waste stream on the energy that you use, right? If I use energy and I'm using too much of it and I power my air conditioner, for example, there's quote unquote no like waste stream. On the farming side, if I use water and then I fertilize it and then I dump it back into a lake, a river, or stream, that's going to pollute the water for the next guy or even for me coming in, because that recursive loop ends up becoming a problem, right? And so that's a little bit of the difference on water and energy. Although I do think there is a lot of learnings in energy and mostly in telecom, right? I think one of the first or second episodes that I did, we made this comparison of telecoms like 50 years ahead of water. Energy is like 20 years ahead of water, and water is like 50 years behind. So how we can there's like definitely learnings in future technologies around infrastructure like that water can look at.
I mean, the question of circularity is interesting. I'm wondering if there are, because of the nature of, this is actually, physical, particles, and you can't exactly it's just not ending, right? It's not like electricity where it ends at the endpoint. Are there particular massive infrastructure upgrades that have to happen to truly start developing a circular water economy? Because I mean, like, it's so distributed, like it'd be very difficult. Each farmer would have to manage their runoff in a particular way. Like, are there ways that you've seen companies trying to solve this problem of capturing the waste streams and then either cleaning them up or putting them back into the top of the funnel?
Yeah, and this is actually what I was talking about with Aaron Tartakovsky from Clean Tech. That's his company. They basically, you're right. So infrastructure will require a major upgrade, right? If you talk about that. However, Aaron's company plugs right into buildings. And so you can actually take, to your example, instead of taking the entire water supply chain, right, inside of, like, let's take New York City, for example, instead of digging up a bunch of roads, replacing all the pipes on a per building layer, you can actually have water recycling systems that decentralize the water recycling objective instead of doing it at the city or municipal water treatment plant. And so it does, I mean, it will require a bit of an infrastructure upgrade because, like you said, there are molecules that are physically moving. However, I think there's a way up and down the chain to actually decentralize it in smaller fractal loops instead of kind of like zooming out it to the larger scale. Municipal side.
Are there, I think if I'm not mistaken, across the battery supply chain, especially in Germany, there's this kind of talk about when you produce a good, you're also going to become responsible for disposing of it. Are there any related laws in terms of who's using water and what your responsibility is? Because it sounds like there's a lot of these really old things going around, like old policies, but do you know of anything that's kind of shifting the responsibility to manage it? Because in the example you just gave, how many building owners are going to actually spend the money to do this when they're like, oh, well, the municipalities are taking care of it. Why should I do it?
Yeah, it does affect your water usage, right? So it's directly a cost on your bottom line because you can power your entire building with fresh water, or you can recycle your water and use a lot of that, which will then lower your water bill, right? And water is only getting more and more expensive because the supply is getting less limited, right? We have day zero issues in Mexico City. We had that in South Africa. So unlike energy where we can, swap solar panels or wind farms or nuclear on top and generate more, water is for the time being kind of a finite good right now. And that obviously is a problem and impacts kind of that question that you just asked around what's really the incentive. And the incentive is cost, right? You can actually lower costs and increase margin on building management in this example.
And let's jump in really quick. What is a day zero issue, just to make sure they're on the same page?
And day zero issue is where you turn your tap on and there's no water that comes out.
Wow. And so you said it's something that we're encountering. We're fortunate. I don't think we're in those regions. So what is that looking like? Just where you're seeing it or experiencing it?
Yeah, I mean, South Africa is the closest case that we've had where they've actually curbed a day zero issue. They were having, I forget exactly the cause, but I assume it's like a drought that they've had for a really long time. They didn't get much rainfall, and that was affecting the city being able to actually provide agriculture, their people with clean water. And so they had to do a bunch of changes across industry, across policy, across water usage. There was things like rationing. And so, there's a whole suite of measures. You guys can look up the South Africa day zero issue. But yeah, it's happening now. It's happening in today's world, and it's happening in places that are very close to us.
I think the policy issue is something really unique. I mean, maybe it's not unique to water, but I think that the water policy framework, if you have, let's take the US, for example. Obviously, US is a big country, but in your last episode, you had mentioned, or she was talking about how there's a very big difference between the West Coast issues and the East Coast issues, like what they have in terms of dealing with water. And I'd be curious to see if, I guess you can't really apply it as a broad stroke because it's different everywhere, but if there are in the core categories of here, we've got drought issues. I think she mentioned something about the East Coast tending to have like usually plenty of water, and then suddenly there's like a challenge. Whereas like you're just used to in the West Coast, they're just used to dealing with, we always have a shortage of water, so we have our policies in one way, but there's no shifting back and forth. I'm just curious if you've seen really practical policy things that have been proposed or have passed in some places that have actually tried to deal with this in a way that the citizenry is understanding. Because the reason I'm trying to get to this question is if you go on a federal level and pass policy across the United States, you're going to have a lot of people, especially like people where I come from. Like if we talked about not having enough rain, people around here would be laughing at you, especially right now. Like it's raining all the time in Wisconsin. Like it's totally fine. So we wouldn't understand the problem, and we would have like probably uproar. People would be really upset about these policies. So do you have any, I know this is a very broad question, but do you have any particular insights that you can offer here?
I think I was trying to actually push Robin on this in my previous episode that you were asking about on if there are examples of this. And because water is so multifaceted, I don't think she really had an answer. And I haven't found it either in the folks that I've interviewed in policy. There's a bunch of small things, and there's kind of this overarching direction that we need to go in around managing the supply and managing usage of water. But I haven't really come across one example. And I think that is because water is so multifaceted as well, right? It's like kind of different, like you just said, in the East Coast versus the West Coast. And so I almost wish there was like a one size fits all piece of policy that we could, circulate a booklet and everybody up and down the, well, from president to your city mayor can implement. But I don't think that there is one.
One perspective I can offer is a lot of it has to do with how water is priced and the fact that water isn't really priced to where it should be, right? So what you confuse for abundance from rain, you don't really have a sentiment of how that even affects you because your water prices are not fluctuating, frankly, like they should, right? To reflect how much is available. You'll see it in places like, the southwest, make sure I'm getting my geography right, southwest of the United States, where you're having constant drought issues. But even then, the prices there aren't really effective. It's more supply constrained, right? And because of this consumer sensitivity, you are not able to communicate effectively, what is the value of water? And I think, I believe, don't quote me on this, I believe it was Ezra Klein has spoken about this. There's been a number of podcasts talking about this issue, which is you can't move the water chain forward because there's not enough money for a utility to come in and manage it and centralize it because the margins would be so low because the prices are so low. So you have, like you said, not only a lack of centralization, but no incentive to centralize. And I think that's an issue as well.
That is an interesting issue. Well, I guess, this is a tough one to talk about. It sounds like the conclusion to it might be that locally people need to really think about these water issues and find incentives that are going to work for their communities. And obviously it's easier to make regulations on a smaller scale level. So that's a good point I think we could take away. But I do want to ask you, from people that you've spoken with, are there particular, I guess markers that they need to typically hit once they're starting their companies to really know, hey, we've got traction, and then the investors get really interested? I mean, you also had some experience with this in the VC you're working with. Like, what are the core things that need to be true in order for a water tech, startup to actually have legs?
Yeah, I think from like a VC perspective, there's 3 risks at kind of any stage that they really want to look at, right? The first obviously is market. Is there a buyer for this? The second is obviously team. Can we actually execute this? And the last is product, right? Because I'm not saying that it's easy to pivot product, but the product are the 3 the kind of easiest to move through. And so if you're looking at that first issue to your question of what do VCs look for and what kind of movement do they need, I think getting product into as many hands as possible that's feasible given your capital constraints would be the biggest marker that you can show to a VC to say that this is actively being used. My product actually does have legs and people are using it right here. I can drive you to a facility and we can actually talk to the plant manager. We can talk to the farmer. We can talk to the building manager. And so I think that would be the first thing that, I also mentor any startup to focus on is hit that publish button, right? Go get out of the building, give this to as many people as possible. Obviously paid, right? You don't have to get away for free. But if you can prove that works, I feel like that's the biggest check mark for a VC.
Yeah, that makes sense. That's helpful. I guess one of the things, since you've had a lot of exposure in space for a while, are there any, globally speaking, are there any hubs for where water tech entrepreneurs, tend to live?
Yeah,
or where this stuff's being built?
I think California was very big because California obviously has a bunch of water related issues. I know Imagine H2O is a great organization. That's actually where I met Tom initially. And they have hubs in Singapore, San Francisco, and I feel like somewhere on the East Coast as well. But honestly, I think a hub is anywhere that there is a critical water issue. I'm sure during a South Africa Day Zero issue where the need is the highest, it'd be great for a bunch of water companies to land there and figure out how to actually solve this problem. Mexico City is next in line, right? They're working heavily on figuring out how to curb their Day Zero issue. Phoenix, for example, I think I've heard stories that they built a bunch of new housing and they don't have water supply for them. And so they're trying to figure out exactly how to bring water to this new development in the city of Phoenix or somewhere outside. And so, yeah, I guess the interesting thing with water is wherever there's a problem in water is kind of the best place that you need to be at because it is such a physical thing.
Yeah. One thing I guess I noticed when we published the Tom episode with Tom from Bird Island, you reached out, there's a whole bunch of people who reach out. It's a very engaged community, it seems. I'm just kind of curious if you have a take as to why that is.
Because it's so decentralized and because the water industry is so spread out, it requires the people that are in water to be a really close-knit family because you need to kind of stick together. And, I wish it was as easy as walking down Hayes Valley in San Francisco and raising for my next AI startup. But unfortunately, water's not like that. And so I think the water folk just need to stick together and they do. And that's probably why when you post an episode with Tom, it's going to get a bunch of comments.
Is all the pool boys finding all the pool girls and everyone making one big happy family? Is that how it works?
That's how it works. Exactly.
Or is there beef with the lifeguards? There's a division there. Is it,
No, there's no division. All the water folks live and breathe in the same house.
Amazing. Ravi, I don't know how the time has escaped us. We're almost at the end. One thing that Silas and I have the absolute pleasure of being able to do is, find out where people think the direction of the industry is headed. But more specifically, if you were, and I think this is also poignant for you, you're a founder. So making you a little uncomfortable and saying, if you were to have to leave your company and found another company, what general problem space would you go into? What to you holds a lot of promise within water tech right now?
I think if we can solve this supply issue in the near term, that would be the biggest thing on allowing us a little bit more breathing room to kind of think clearly about what we need to do from a policy perspective, from just a supply perspective, from like an infrastructure perspective. And what I mean by supply is kind of everything I've talked about, right? This gray water, black water remediation. I had an amazing episode with Jeff Langholtz from the Middlebury Institute around atmospheric water supply. Is how do we capture water from moisture in the air? And so any way of kind of adding to the supply side, I feel like gives us a little bit more breathing room to kind of just sit down and figure out what to do next.
That's a good point.
Is the ideal solution in that a utility, right? Because that takes a lot more than just a startup to start, right? Do you really think, and do you think there's tailwinds to say that it can be done by a startup, or does it require policy? I'm just curious because I feel like when I hear that, I'm like, oh yeah, you're agreed. That's amazing.
Yeah.
But I don't know what the operating model of success would be. Do you have a take on what would work, or honestly, what we know doesn't work?
I don't know if I quite have an answer for that yet. And that's kind of why Liquid Assets looks at business policy and technology all through the episodes that we have. If I was to take a crack to answer your question, I almost feel like water needs a separate sort of financing arm that can actually push it forward. And I'd actually shared an article with you guys a little while ago around a hybrid VC PE model, right? I think if you have something that's like VC that can fund the initial de-risking of the technology and then move it into more of a PE model that's heavy hitting, that can like work with things like infrastructure, work with things like debt financing, to work with the utility, will give you different types of capital to leverage the technology as it moves into different stages of its lifespan. And I think water probably needs like an interesting financing vehicle like that with the parties, and probably some sort of like a startup studio model, right? Kind of like plug and play or something like that, that has all the folks in the room that are going to help out, which I think is what Imagine H2O is trying to do, right? With policy and large corporates, with the startups. And so I think it is a bit more of a multifaceted approach, but you're right. It's not going to be picking what we currently have off the shelf with, typical Silicon Valley VC and, or even, Wall Street private equity. And so something else I think needs to be built out in the middle.
It makes a lot of sense. I think that, as you've been saying some of these things, it makes me, feel a little bit that, the water tech people in general have, they've been around, I'd say probably a lot of the people, at least Tom had mentioned, since before climate tech really became a big thing. So they're like, climate tech's getting all this traction, and they're seeing a lot of overlap from climate tech into water tech now, which is helpful. But at the same time, there's still no necessarily like true unique network built out besides what Tom and Imagine H2O have done. So there still needs to be some more specific vehicles because it has really, really unique challenges. So that would be interesting to see. If anybody's listening and knows of some of these vehicles, let us know. We'd love to chat with you about it. But anyways, man, this has been a real pleasure to be able to get kind of your insights from everybody you've spoken with. Any final calls to the audience, or where you would have people reach you?
Yeah, you can look me up on LinkedIn at Ravi Karani. Shoot me a follow or an ad. I respond to most of my messages as long as it's not spam. You want to follow at Liquid Assets, go to liquidassets.cc.
Awesome, man. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me on, guys. And for all of those of you out there, if you want to listen to Liquid Assets, you can find us at liquidassets.cc or anywhere else you get your podcasts, or on YouTube today.